Welcome to Music Legendarium. Miles Davis, the man who reinvented jazz. On May 26, 1926, in the small river town of Alton, Illinois, a future musical revolutionary entered the world. His name was Miles Dewey Davis III. Few artists have changed the course of music as dramatically as Miles Davis. During a career that spanned nearly 50 years, he repeatedly transformed jazz, refusing to remain tied to a single style. Whenever audiences thought they understood him, he moved in a new direction. His influence reached far beyond jazz. Musicians from rock, pop, funk, fusion, and even hip-hop would later draw inspiration from his ideas. By the end of his life, Miles Davis was no longer simply a trumpet player. He had become one of the defining artists of the 20th century. But long before the awards, the sold-out concerts, and the legendary recordings, he was simply a young boy. Miles was born into a relatively prosperous African-American family. His father, Miles Dewey Davis II, was a successful dentist, while his mother, Cleota May Davis, was both a teacher and a talented musician. The family eventually settled in East St. Louis, where Miles spent most of his childhood. Together with his sister Dorothy May and his brother Vernon, he grew up in an environment that encouraged learning and personal achievement. Music was always present in the Davis household. His mother hoped that her son would study the violin, believing it to be a refined and respectable instrument. Miles, however, was fascinated by something. When Miles was about 13 years old, his father gave him a trumpet. That gift would change the course of his life. It did not take long for those around him to recognize his unusual talent. One of the most important influences during these early years was his teacher, Elwood Buchanan. Buchanan encouraged him to play with a clean tone and to avoid excessive vibrato, a technique that was popular among many trumpet players of the time. The lesson stayed with him forever. Years later, that clear, direct, and emotionally controlled sound would become one of the defining characteristics of Miles Davis's playing. While still in school, he joined local bands and gained valuable experience performing in public. His skills developed quickly, and before long he was already attracting attention, a life-changing encounter. In 1944, an unexpected opportunity arrived. The famous Billy Eckstine Orchestra came to St. Louis for a performance. Several musicians were unavailable, and the young Miles was given a chance to sit in with the band. What happened next would alter the course of his life. For the first time, he found himself surrounded by some of the most exciting figures in modern jazz, including Charlie Parker and Dizzy Gillespie. These musicians were pushing jazz into entirely new territory, creating a faster, more complex style that would soon become known as bebop. Miles was captivated. Later that same year, he moved to New York City. Officially, he enrolled at the prestigious Juilliard School of Music, yet the classroom was not. By day, Miles attended classes at Juilliard. By night, he explored the vibrant jazz clubs of Harlem, listening to the musicians who were transforming American music. Before long, he achieved something many young musicians could only dream of. He began performing with Charlie Parker himself. Parker was one of the architects of bebop, a revolutionary style built on rapid tempos, advanced harmonies, and daring improvisation. Playing alongside him was both a challenge and an education. Between 1945 and 1948, Miles participated in numerous recording sessions with Parker. At first, some critics compared him unfavorably to Dizzy Gillespie, whose dazzling technical abilities were unmatched. But Miles was not interested in sounding like anyone else. Instead of overwhelmed by the late 1940s, Miles Davis was already searching for a new musical direction. Working closely with arranger Gil Evans and several other innovative musicians, he began experimenting with a different approach to jazz. The result was a series of recordings made in 1949 and 1950 that would later be released under the title Birth of the Cool. The music sounded unlike anything that had come before. Where bebop was fast and explosive, this new style was elegant, spacious, and carefully arranged. It emphasized texture and atmosphere rather than sheer intensity. Today, many historians consider these recordings the birth of cool jazz. For Miles Davis, however, it was only the beginning. He had taken his first major step as a musical innovator, but the early 1950s should have been a period of growth for Miles Davis. Instead, they became some of the most difficult years of his life. Like many musicians of the era, he became addicted to heroin. The addiction began to affect both his career and his reputation. Recording opportunities became less frequent, performances suffered, and many people in the jazz world believed that his promising future was slipping away. For a time, it seemed as though another gifted musician might be lost to addiction. But Miles Davis refused to let that happen. Returning to his father's farm in Illinois, he endured the painful process of withdrawal largely on his own. It required extraordinary determination and self-discipline. When he finally emerged from that struggle, he was healthier, more focused, and more determined than ever. The comeback that followed would become one of the most remarkable recoveries in jazz history. In 1955, Miles Davis stepped onto the stage at the Newport Jazz Festival and reminded the world exactly who he was. His performance of the jazz standard Round Midnight left audiences and critics deeply impressed. The elegance of his playing, the emotional depth of his sound, and the confidence of his musical vision made it clear that he was back. The appearance changed everything. Soon afterward, Columbia Records offered him a recording contract, opening the door to a new chapter in his career. Around the same time, Miles assembled what would later be remembered as one of the greatest jazz groups ever formed. The lineup included saxophonist John Coltrane, pianist Red Garland, bassist Paul Chambers, and drummer Philly Joe Jones. Together, they created music that would help define modern jazz. Among all of Miles Davis's musical partnerships, few were as important as his relationship with John Coltrane. The two musicians challenged and inspired one another. Their different approaches created a creative tension that pushed both artists to new heights. Then came 1959. In that year, Miles Davis entered the studio to record what many consider the greatest jazz album ever made, Kind of Blue. The musicians assembled for the session were extraordinary. Alongside Miles were John Coltrane, Cannonball Adderley, Bill Evans, Paul Chambers, and Jimmy Cobb. Instead of relying on complex chord changes, Miles explored modal jazz, a style that gave musicians greater freedom to improvise and develop ideas naturally. The result was music that felt open, timeless, and deeply expressive. Tracks such as So What and Freddie Freeloader became classics, while Kind of Blue went on to become the best-selling jazz album in history. Many artists spend their careers repeating a formula that has already brought them success. Miles Davis did the exact opposite. As the 1960s unfolded, he once again began searching for new possibilities. He formed what became known as his Second Great Quintet, featuring Wayne Shorter, Herbie Hancock, Ron Carter, and Tony Williams. The group pushed jazz into new territory, creating music that was more adventurous, more sophisticated, and often more unpredictable than anything Miles had done before. Yet, despite its complexity, the music never lost its sense of purpose. One of Miles Davis's greatest talents was his ability to recognize potential. Time and again, he surrounded himself. By the late 1960s, Miles Davis had become fascinated by new sounds coming from the world of rock music. Artists such as Jimi Hendrix captured his attention, and Miles began exploring the possibilities of electronic instruments, amplified keyboards, and rock-inspired rhythms. In 1969, he released In a Silent Way. Soon afterward came Brew. The impact was enormous. These recordings blended jazz improvisation with electric instruments, powerful grooves, and long, free-flowing musical structures. The result was something entirely new. A movement that would later be known as jazz fusion had arrived. Not everyone welcomed the change. Some traditional jazz fans felt that Miles had abandoned the music they loved. But Miles Davis had never been interested in standing still. Looking back today, many historians consider this period one of the most innovative and influential chapters of his career. Once again, he had expanded the boundaries of what jazz could become. The final years and an enduring legacy. The 1970s brought serious health problems and periods of physical exhaustion. For several years, Miles Davis largely withdrew from public life and recorded very little music. Many believed that his remarkable career had finally come to an end. Once again, they were wrong. In 1981, he returned to the stage with yet another new musical vision. Embracing synthesizers, modern production techniques, and influences from pop, funk, and rock, he introduced himself to a new generation of listeners. Miles never allowed expectations to define him. He followed his curiosity wherever it led. His interpretation of human nature, originally recorded by Michael Jackson, demonstrated how open-minded and forward-looking he remained throughout his life. Until his final years, he continued to perform, record, and inspire musicians around the world. On September 28, 1991, Miles Davis died in Santa Monica, California, at the age of 65. Complications resulting from a stroke, pneumonia, and respiratory failure brought an end to an extraordinary life. Yet his influence never disappeared. From Birth of the Cool to Kind of Blue, from his groundbreaking quintets to the revolutionary sounds of Brew, Miles Davis continually redefined the possibilities of modern music. He was far more than a trumpet player. He was an explorer, an innovator, and a restless creative force who refused to accept limitations. That is why, decades after his death, Miles Davis remains not only a jazz legend, but one of the most important and influential artists of the 20th century. Thanks for watching, and I hope to see you next time.